Hello and welcome back to another video on the resurrection of Christ. Today, we're going to be discussing the non-biblical sources of Tacitus and Josephus. These are very important sources when we're turning to non-biblical references to the 8 facts that we have discussed in previous videos. So it's important that in this section, we go over these 2 sources and see whether they're reliable or not. Before we get into the video, I would like to remind you that if you enjoy this content, feel free to like and subscribe. It will really help this channel grow, and it's completely free, so you can always change your mind. So let's get into the video. So I'd like to split this video into a few sections. First, I'll look at Tacitus, then I'll look at Josephus, and then I'll just look at them two and compare them with other sources at the time, so we can have a comparison of how reliable these 2 sources are. So let's first look at Tacitus. When I refer to Tacitus, I'm normally referring to his book, The Annals. This book is basically written by Tacitus and describes the events of the time, about emperors, about politics, about war, and a lot of these things that he as a politician and a Roman orator were interested in. This close connection with politics and the Roman Senate and the Roman government makes him a very good, reliable source for the time. Furthermore, his methodology and his precision is generally regarded as pretty good. But put that aside, let's look at the book specifically and see how long after the actual events was it written. Because when we look at history sources, the further after an event, the more unreliable it becomes. Although we don't exactly know when Tacitus started writing the Annals, we know that he was writing the Annals by 107 AD. So this is at most 74 years after the events of Christ. While it sounds or seems like quite a lot, it's actually, as we'll see later, not too much. So let's turn to Josephus. Josephus was basically a Jewish historian and is seen as one of the best Jewish historians of the time period. He described Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, and his books on the Jewish wars and Jewish traditions are seen as one of the best sources in ancient history about Judaism. So basically, when we turn to Josephus, we're discussing the book, The Antiquities of the Jews, which was written around 93 to 94 AD. So this is around 60 years after the death of Christ. In Josephus' book, The Antiquities of the Jews, he basically has 2 main references to Jesus. Firstly, it's what we call the Testimonium Flavianus. Okay, I probably completely butchered the name. But this is normally seen as the less reliable of the 2 sources. The reason for this is because it describes Jesus in a positive light, which is somewhat weird for Josephus, who is clearly anti-Christian. So there is some suspicion that there was some later alteration to the original source. However, the extent of this alteration is unknown, and it's possible that only a few words were changed, so it's seen as somewhat trustworthy, but there's also some room for error or doubt. The second more important source is basically in his Antiquities, the same book, but 2 books later in book 20 instead of 18. In this section, there's basically 1 sentence about Jesus, which says, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. This is commonly acknowledged as authentic and is seen rather trustworthy because it's just a factual claim of who Jesus was and who his brother was. So now that we've looked at Josephus and Tacitus, let's compare them to the other sources of the time. So since these 2 sources were written after the time of Jesus, they're normally seen as secondary sources. The Bible is normally seen as a primary source for the events of the Gospels or of Jesus' life, but Tacitus and Josephus are normally seen as secondary sources. But when we compare them to other primary and secondary sources of the time, we realize that the time frame or the time gap between the actual events and the time of writing, Josephus and Tacitus actually are closer to primary sources than to secondary sources. So a good example of a primary source would be Polybius and the Punic Wars. Most historians today recognize that Polybius, a Greek historian, is the best source when we come to study the Punic Wars, a war fought between Rome and Carthage. Polybius basically was born halfway through the war at around 200 BC, the war starting at around 264 BC. This is around 64 years after the war started, and hence it's clear that he wrote the books at least 70, if not 80 years after the start of the war, because it's clear that he just couldn't write at 1 year old. He was probably writing at 20 years old. So we see there's a clear around 80 or 70 year time gap between the time he starts writing and the first events that he was describing. So this gap, when compared to the gap of Josephus and Tacitus to the crucifixion, is actually kind of similar. Even though Josephus and Tacitus were secondary sources, their time difference between the events they described and their accounts is actually the same as a primary source for a very important event in Roman history. So, as we can see, it appears that these sources of Tacitus and Josephus are pretty trustworthy. But let's talk about secondary sources of the time, because that would be a fair comparison about the good or the bad of Tacitus and Josephus, because as Tacitus and Josephus are seen as secondary sources, or at least when compared to the gospel accounts. So let us compare Tacitus and Josephus to the secondary sources of the time. As we have already seen, the time frame of Tacitus and Josephus are actually closer to the primary source than the secondary source. But for even fairer comparison, let us discuss the secondary sources of the time. Let's turn to the Punic Wars yet again. The secondary sources for the Punic Wars are namely Livy, Appian, and Plutarch. There's way more historians and way more sources, but these are the three main sources for the Punic Wars. Livy was born around 100 years after the end of the war. Appian was born around 250 years after the end of the war. And Plutarch was born 200 years after the end of the war. These are significant gaps and are greatly farther back than Tacitus and Josephus, showing that Tacitus and Josephus are superb secondary sources. So from these two reasons, we can see that Tacitus and Josephus, although are the secondary sources for the gospel events, their time frame is more like a contemporary source than a secondary source. So we can confirm that quoting Tacitus and Josephus is reliable, and unless there's some significant historical bias, Tacitus and Josephus are really great sources to use and should not be doubted by any historian. So if you've enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe, hit the bell notification so you are updated whenever I make a new upload. Have a great week, stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.